Hello and welcome to Sourcing in Procurement and Supply, Unit 5, Sourcing in Private, Third and Public Sector. Sourcing practices differ among the various sectors. In the private sector, they may have their own peculiar issues or laws that they use. However, in the public sector, one will have to contend with strict procurement laws. So we are going to examine the key features of procurement practices among the various sectors in this very unit, the Unit 5. So without wasting much time, let's just get into the first section, private sector organizations. By the end of this section, we should be able to explain the nature of private sector organizations, identify the forms of private sector organizations, mention sources of finance in the private sector organizations, explain the objectives of private sector organizations, and explain the regulation of private sector organizations. The nature and form of private sector organizations. Private sector organizations, as we already know, are organizations that are owned and controlled by private individuals who pursue profit as their main objective. Because their main objective is to make profits, this is going to influence how procurement activities are carried out in such a sector. Now, private sector organizations comes in various forms. We're going to go through some of these forms. One, we have in terms of ownership and control. For instance, in private sector, we have organizations that are owned and controlled by one person, which is the sole proprietorship. We also have the partnerships where two or more individuals come together to form an organization. Then we have the limited companies, where a group of shareholders come together to form a company. However, this company has or is considered to have a separate legal entity from the owners or from their shareholders. So the company can own assets, it can enter into contracts and even incur liabilities in its own name, in the company's name. And in the case of bankrupts, the shareholders are only liable to the amount of capital contributed in the organization. They don't lose their personal assets because the company has a separate legal entity from that of the shareholders. So that is the first classification for the private sector organizations in terms of ownership and control, where we have the sole proprietorship control, where organizations are managed and controlled by one person. We have the partnerships where two or more people come together to form an organization, and then the limited liability companies. We also have the classification in terms of size. For instance, we have SMEs, we have the large multinational corporations, and so on. So MBSSI defines SMEs in using the number of employees in each organization. So we are saying that according to the MBSSI, if an organization has up to 29 employees, that organization is a small organization. If it has up to 99 employees, then it is a medium organization, medium-sized enterprise. And if it has more than 99 employees, then it's a large organization. And the third classification we have here is in terms of their business activities. That is the primary purpose of the organization, what the organization is known for. So we are saying that an organization can be classified as a primary industry when it engages in the extraction of raw materials. A secondary industry is one that engages in manufacturing, and then a tertiary industry will be one that engages in services or one that provides services. So these are the three main classifications of private sector organizations. We have the first one to be the ownership and control. The second one to be the SMEs, the large and multinational corporations. And then finally, we have their business activities. Now, let's look at some sources of funds in the private sector organizations. One key source of funds for private sector organizations will be the initial capital invested by the owners of the organization. So as a shareholder, as a sole proprietor or as someone engaged in a partnership organization, the initial capital, the initial money we invest in the business, that's what we refer to as the initial capital invested by the owners. Then we also have the share capital, that is the sale of shares in the company. So private organizations, the private sector organizations usually issue shares. They sell shares to private individuals and then invest the money obtained from selling these shares into the business. That's what we refer to as the share capital. We have the retained profit. At the end of the period, whatever profits we gain, we don't squander everything. We don't use everything. We calculate a percentage and plug it back into the business. Then we have the loan finance, where the organization would usually go for a loan from the banks or private individuals, private organizations to manage and run their organization, their businesses, with the aim of paying back, usually with an interest. We also have government grants, where government funds the ideas of private individuals to provide public services and in order to stimulate the economy. And these private individuals do not need to pay back these government grants. The government is funding your idea, is funding your project in order for you to provide public services, in order for you to provide employment for the people, in order for you to stimulate the economy. So these are some sources of funds for the public sector organizations. Profitability objective and its influence on procurement in the private sector. As we have already seen, the primary objective for a private sector organization is normally to maximize profit. Procurement staff in a profit-seeking organization or procurement staff in these private sector organizations may well feel pressured to achieve the lowest possible cost when purchasing supplies. But this does not mean they have to sacrifice or they will have to sacrifice all other considerations in order to choose the lowest cost option. It's not because you are seeking to make profits in the organization that's why you have to always be considering the lowest possible available or presented to you. We need to pay critical attention to other factors as well. We can't compromise on our quality. We can't compromise on delivery. We can't compromise on the nature or state of our final output simply because we need to make profits in the organization. For example, a more expensive material of higher quality might lead to lower level of waste and reworks, which in the long run may work out to be cheaper than had you gone for an inferior material. Procurement professionals in the private sector organizations must look at the longer term benefits of their organization and more complex definitions of value. This could mean an in-depth assessment of potential supplies along a number of dimensions, not just price. Remember, we are looking at the long-term benefits, the long-term picture here, not just the short-term. Competition and market share. Private sector organizations face intense competition to innovate and stay competitive. They may be pursuing cost advantage or differentiation. In any of these approaches, procurement has a role to play. So for instance, if it's about cost, procurement's role is to secure input at reasonable cost so that overall cost of production will be low. If it's about differentiation, seeking for suppliers with unique capabilities to contribute to the uniqueness of the firm's product will be key. The regulation of private sector organization procurement. The procurement of these private sector organizations, the regulations. The influence of government. There are four main areas in which a nation's government influences private sector organizations. We know in the public sector organizations, governments have direct influence. The public sector exists for the government, right? It's the government that funds these public sector organizations, so it has direct influence. However, with the private sector, because they are owned and controlled by private individuals, the government does not have direct influence. However, the government can influence certain areas of private sector organizations, how they do their business. So we're going to go through some of these areas there in which the government can influence private sector organizations. One, we have government influence the operations of organizations, who they can and cannot produce, and how they can produce it. Example, in laying down restrictions on production processes in order to protect the environment. So for instance, in this country, the government can make it illegal to produce marijuana. Even if they're making it legal, the government is the one going to tell you how to go about your production. And if you go contrary to what the government is saying, you end up facing legal consequences. We also have the government's influence on cost and revenue incurred by organizations by the application of taxes and duties on the production and sale of certain goods and by the effects of taxes on the general level of consumer spending. Private organizations, private individuals pay taxes. So it's the government can have an influence on the cost you charge, your cost of production, the revenues incurred in your production process by the kind of taxes and duties they charge you. Governments influence organizations by the actions they take in pursuing macroeconomic objectives. For instance, in establishing exchange rates and interest rates, by the extent to which they stimulate aggregate demand in the economy. Governments also influence the values and norms that are regarded as acceptable within the national culture and hence indirectly affect the outputs produced by organizations and the ways in which organizations behave. By way of conclusion, we have defined private sector and the nature of the firms in this sector. We also looked at some of the key features of private sector organizations that have implications for procurement. One of these key features is profitability. Also, competition for market share also influences procurement activities because issues of quality, delivery schedules, etc. are key when pursuing competitive advantage. Regulations of the private sector by government was also explored. Thank you.